This video is brought to you by True Tales of Buried Treasure, the largest collection of old treasure magazines in the West. On our website, you can search for individual treasure stories by region, or buy our original magazines themselves. To pay us a visit, please click on the link in the description. Enjoy. About 12 miles north of Freedom, Oklahoma, on a lonely, windswept ridge within the 5,500-acre hill ranch shortgrass pasture, lies a tiny burial ground. Though a wooden sign marks it as a cemetery, it has never been officially designated as one. 2 men are buried there, both believed to have been murdered during what many say was the last Indian raid in Oklahoma. Locals have always called it the Old Cowboy's Graveyard, says Iona Wares. Mrs. Wares should know. She was born on a neighboring ranch and has lived just 2 miles from the site since she married at age 28. Her uncle, Frank King, was among those said to have discovered the cowboys' bodies near that hill more than a century ago. Some, however, believe the men were killed by white outlaws and that the blame was deliberately placed on Native Americans. Both theories remain plausible. Over 100 years later, the truth is still unknown. The 2 cowboys had been working for the Colcord Ranch in Kansas. The Colcord was part of the Comanche Pool, officially known as the Comanche County, Kansas Cattle Pool, the largest cattle operation ever established in the state. At its peak, it managed more than 80,000 head of cattle, grazing as one massive herd across over 1,200 square miles of open range, some of the best grasslands to be found anywhere. Such a large herd needed a steady supply of salt to stay healthy, and the most accessible source was located on the salt flats of the Cimarron River, near what is now Freedom, Oklahoma. Though these flats were across the border in Indian Territory, cowboys often made the trip south to load up on the valuable mineral. It was during one of these trips, on September 9, 1878, that Fred Clark and Reuben Bristow left the Colcord Ranch for the salt flats, just as tensions were flaring on the Cheyenne Reservation in Indian Territory. The Northern Cheyenne had been promised food, protection, and the freedom to return north if they were unhappy, living alongside their Southern Cheyenne relatives. So, in the spring of 1877, 937 Northern Cheyennes arrived at the Cheyenne and Arapaho Agency at Camp Supply. Later, they were relocated to a site called Cantonment, near present-day Canton, Oklahoma. Conditions quickly worsened. Their horses were starving and the people soon followed. Hunting was forbidden, and even if they had been allowed, there were no buffalo left. Commercial hunters had wiped out the great herds, taking only the hides and leaving the meat to rot in the prairie sun. Without buffalo for food, clothing, and shelter, the Cheyenne were reduced to relying on inadequate government rations. They became agency sitters, forced to beg for supplies. Malaria plagued the camp during each new moon, and there was never enough quinine to go around. Warm blankets and decent clothing were scarce. Even the wives of tribal leaders were forced to wear rags. Hunger was so extreme that even the camp dogs became fair game for cooking pots. Desperate and disillusioned, the Northern Cheyenne, especially under leaders Morning Star, also known as Dull Knife, and Little Wolf, asked Indian agent John D. Miles for permission to return north to their ancestral lands along the Powder River in the Dakotas. Miles refused. Settlers had already claimed the land, he told them. There was no place for the Cheyenne there anymore. This bewildered the Cheyenne, who believed the land belonged to everyone. So they talked it over quietly, and in the fall, they made a decision. Long before Oklahoma became a state, 2 cowboys, riding out to collect salt, were found murdered near this very ridge, now part of the vast hill ranch north of Freedom. Their deaths are remembered in legend, marked by a lonely grave and a mystery that still lingers in the prairie wind. Kirk Brown, the great-grandson of original ranch owner R.E. Hill, stands as a quiet witness to the land's history. It was on this very ground that a mystery unfolded, one that's haunted this corner of Oklahoma since 1878. Despite the growing unrest in Indian Territory, 2 cowboys, Fred Clark and Reuben Bristow, decided to make the risky trip south from the Colcord Ranch in Kansas to gather a load of salt from the Cimarron River flats. On the very same night, September 9, 1878, around 500 Northern Cheyenne, mostly women, children, and elders, slipped away from the cantonment reservation under cover of darkness. Starving, sick, and desperate, they had finally made the heartbreaking decision to return to their ancestral homeland in the Dakotas. "I would rather die in freedom on the way back to my home than starve to death here," said their leader, Dull Knife, a sentiment echoed by many others. As the Cheyenne moved north and the cowboys traveled south, their paths likely crossed. Some old-timers recalled seeing the Cheyenne pass by, tired, dusty, ragged, and hungry. Soldiers, posses, and armed civilians relentlessly pursued them. Desperate for horses and firearms, the Cheyenne may have had motive to attack Clark and Bristow. They were in the right place at the right time. But not everyone believes that's what happened. At the time, illegal whiskey ranches dotted the Dodge Supply Trail, fueling vice and violence. 5 were reportedly in the area, 2 on Bluff Creek, 2 on Bear Creek, and 1 on the Cimarron near the Salt Flats. These ranches were notorious for selling stolen horses, gambling, prostitution, and firewater. One version of the story suggests that Clark and Bristow stopped at a whiskey ranch, played poker, and the game turned deadly. Some believe they were murdered by other white men and the scene staged to appear like a native raid. When the cowboys failed to return, a search party from the Comanche Pool was dispatched. Frank King, the foreman of the Colcord Ranch, was among the riders. Though King passed away in 1914, his wife Almeda lived another 50 years, and she often shared memories of those rugged days with her niece, Iona Wares. "I was not quite 6 when Uncle Frank died," Mrs. Wares recalls, "but I remember clearly the stories Aunt Almeda told." King and his men found the bodies of Clark and Bristow on September 12, 1878, near the head of Jugmont Creek on the high divide between the Cimarron and Salt Fork watersheds. The men had camped by a spring just across the line in Indian Territory. When discovered, their wagon was partially burned, their horses gone. Bristow had been shot in the back of the head. A cluster of arrows was embedded in his chest. Clark's body also bore arrow wounds. "My aunt said the men were so swollen their bodies filled the bed of the wagon," Mrs. Wares recounts. The crew hauled the wrecked wagon back up the ridge. Using shovels and spades, they dug a single grave for both men. The dry clay soil made digging tough under the searing September sun. 2 men worked, while a third kept watch from the highest point of the divide, guarding against possible danger. "They left the boots on, pulled out the arrows, and said a simple prayer," Mrs. Wares says. "They were just cowboys, uneducated, with no chance to attend church, but they honored their own." Today, the exact truth behind Clark and Bristow's deaths remains a mystery. Whether killed by desperate Cheyenne or duplicitous outlaws, they are remembered at a lonely ridge in the Hill Ranch pasture, where a modest wooden sign marks what locals still call the old cowboy's graveyard. Charles Colcord, employer of the 2 slain cowboys and cousin to Reuben Bristow, helped bury the men. Years later, he recalled the moment in stark detail. None of the cowboys had ever attended church or Sunday school. When it came time to bury their friends, they were at a loss for words. "We didn't know what to say," Colcord admitted, "but it didn't seem right to leave the dead without a prayer." So, with solemn respect, he removed his hat and simply said, "God, take care of these poor boys." 2 cedar posts were placed at the head and foot of the grave to mark their final resting place. Nearly 40 years later, R.E. Hill homesteaded the land where the grave was located. He built a sturdy fence around it to keep the cattle out and erected a wooden sign to honor the memory of the fallen cowboys. Then, in the 1940s, a farmer named John Waters carved a simple sandstone tombstone and placed it over the grave. The rough, weathered inscription, misspelled but heartfelt, still reads, "2 cowboys and Salt Hall killed by Indians." But were they really killed by Native Americans? At least 2 other men were killed in the region around the same time. Some say it was no more than the usual violence of the untamed frontier, where outlaws, cattle thieves, and rival stockmen often clashed in bloodshed. A highway marker between Alva and Camp Houston tells a different part of the story. It commemorates the Battle of Turkey Springs, the last recorded conflict between Native Americans and the U.S. Army in Oklahoma, fought on September 13th to 14th, 1878. The sign states that Northern Cheyennes killed 2 cowboys employed by W.R. Colcord and then clashed with elements of the 4th Cavalry under Captain Joseph Rendelbrock. An Arapaho scout and 3 U.S. soldiers were killed in the engagement. 3 other soldiers and 5 Cheyennes were wounded. Of the small Cheyenne group that escaped north, most were later captured and imprisoned at various forts. Little Wolf, one of their respected leaders, was among those taken to Fort Keogh. In later accounts, Little Wolf maintained that his people had been under strict orders not to harm civilians. "We didn't kill anyone until after one of our young men traveling on the side was shot by a cowboy," he explained. After that, some Cheyennes retaliated, but it was against his orders. From the beginning, he said, the Cheyenne were told only to defend themselves, never to strike first, and never to kill unless attacked. Today, the wind still howls like a lonesome coyote over the high divide above Camp Houston. The wooden sign on the so-called Cowboy Cemetery creaks as it sways in the breeze, just like the century-old debate over who really committed the murders that dark September in 1878. Was it the last Indian raid in Oklahoma, or a crime pinned on a people already being hunted and displaced? No one can say for certain, but the grave remains, a quiet marker on the land, and a lasting reminder of how much history can be buried in dust and silence. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to read the original article or purchase the magazine from which it was taken, please check out our website, truetalesofburiedtreasure.com.